And I read your book. It's amazing. So I think everybody here knows Professor Smith, Kurt. And if you don't, I'll let him introduce himself a little more. But I just want to thank you for taking part in this.
Thank you.
And can't wait to hear it.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I want to thank all of you for in attendance, for allowing me to present my book. And I want to thank Jonathan White and the rest of the Bentley Service Learning and Civic Engagement Department. My book is called Homelessness and Housing Advocacy, The Role of Red Tape Warriors. And those red tape warriors are the social service workers who work with their homeless clients, getting them through the housing system. As you'll see, it's a pretty bureaucratic housing system, a lot of roadblocks, a heavy bureaucracy, but these red tape warriors have certain strategies to help out and help circumvent those barriers. And so I want to start off by saying that the city where this study took place, was Salt Lake City, and it received national attention for housing 96% of their chronic homeless population. Now, that is definitely high, and they're a unique city, and I was fortunate enough to be there, but I want to emphasize that every major city in the United States is housing people much higher rates than we often think of. We often think that maybe that doesn't happen at all. We see somebody who's experiencing homelessness, we think they're there all the time. Actually, places like LA are housing people, I think it's like over 200 people per day, but the big part of that is more than that, about 260 or 270 end up going homeless, new and freshly homeless, being evicted to the streets. So it's at a higher rate that people are being displaced, but these red tape warriors are getting people in right and left. I like to start off with making that point. So how do they do it becomes sort of a research question, right? I wanted to get in at their strategies, because I know a lot of people aren't really familiar with how they're doing this. So I start off the book by pointing to something that you all, I'm sure, are familiar with, the COVID-19, the way they implemented the vaccines. Not everyone could get a vaccine when we first started the vaccination process, right? It was only set aside for certain groups. And if you weren't a part of those certain groups, you had to wait in line. You didn't have access to those vaccines. Think about that metaphor while I'm talking about certain groups that are gaining access to housing. But if you remember, during the COVID-19 pandemic, there were workers who were caught in a snowstorm, and they had vaccines in the back seat of the car. Do you remember this? There was a blizzard, and they thought to themselves, they exercised their discretionary power. They said, you know what? We're going to go offer vaccines to anybody who wants them, and they started knocking on the windows of cars. There's another scenario where younger people were dressing up to look older and like elderly, and of course they could have been turned away, but the workers, either their discretionary power vaccinated them anyways, and there were news stories about that. So it all comes down to the and anytime you think about when you call into customer service agents and whether or not they're helpful or not, right? They'll either transfer you to another department, or if you get the right person, they can help you even more than you expected when you made the phone call. So that's what this is all about. And in sociology, I was obviously focusing on the social service workers, but in sociology, I passed this one up. In sociology, we have a theoretical framework always, and Michael Lipsky's notion of street-level bureaucracy fits this quite nicely, because what Michael Lipsky focuses on is, despite workers being at the bottom level of their employment hierarchy, such as teachers who might use resources for their favorite students, but then they're very punitive with other students who they don't like. Or a textbook example of a street-level bureaucrat would be police officers who, even though they're at the bottom level technically of their employment hierarchy, can exercise great discretionary power when they play judge, jury, and executioner, when they pull out their guns and shoot someone, right? And so those are the textbook street-level bureaucrats. Oftentimes, research focuses on how these street-level bureaucrats are denying people services because they don't want to help them. You'll find in this book, I'm observing quite the opposite. They're going above and beyond what they're supposed to be doing and actually helping more people in better ways. And so that's my analysis. All right, so my research methods for this, you'll see I've got 3 different data sets. My first data set, what I've been calling my pilot study, was when I went in during a class in grad school and I was getting in good and making connections with different service agencies, service providers in a few different cities. Did some ethnographic field work and came to the realization after doing 4 in-depth interviews as well at the end that I wanted to focus in one of the cities around this geographic area known as the Block. The Block is this area where there was a notorious area where there were a lot of people experiencing homelessness, but also a lot of crime. And so I focused in on that area. There were about 60, I was told there were about 60 workers total in that area. I had face-to-face interaction and observed about 45, so I saturated the field. And I want to emphasize that, I did 200 hours worth of ethnographic field work. A lot of, when I teach this, I'm actually teaching this course, so I'm going teaching this kind of stuff as well in the semester. But oftentimes people think of quantitative data as the only data, and qualitative they picture investigative reporting where they're cherry picking quotes and that's about it. No, that's very different. So ethnographic field work, that 200 hours, I actually had, and this is it. I've had colleagues that'll do this for 10 years at a time. It takes a lot longer. There are thousands of pages of field notes, and mine I had 1,000, and you can imagine that data was then assessed line by line. Coding was analyzed, and oftentimes you can see things come, you could revisit it with new eyes and emergent themes come out and you say, oh, I didn't even notice that was a major theme. And that's what qualitative data is in a nutshell. So I followed up the ethnographies with 5 in-depth interviews with some of my key respondents who were red tape warriors. And then there's finally my last data set here, which comes from my own previous employment as a social service worker. I used to go under the bridges and strike up conversations and refer people into housing. And so I was able to add some context, contextual value to what my respondents were saying in the field. And so I understood it a lot better than maybe somebody else who just sort of casually comes in and says, I'm going to study homelessness. My own experience, I started out in Cincinnati, Ohio. I ran a few programs in some other cities. I did this dissertation work in the Salt Lake City area out here, and as you all know, I'm here in Boston with you at Bentley. So I have many key informants here, but I want to focus in on one here. His name is Jerome, and Jerome worked in the area called the Block for 17 years. And the thing about Jerome was when we would exit the emergency shelter there to the streets, we would get flocked by dozens of people that would recognize him and want his help. And I asked him later, like, why do they come to you and not some other worker? And he says, basically, I don't pass the buck. I'm going to know their situation. He knew so in that crowd, if you can picture, first person, he says, your cousin's looking for you. And then the next person, he says, check your mailbox. I saw a letter for you. It came from the housing authority, and the next person is like, I don't know what check your mail too. I don't know if it was like an ID or whatever, but he knew every single person on the streets, which was very important. And when this is a map of the area of the Block, you'll see here, and I'm sorry about my cursor floating around, but you see here the dotted lines is the area called the Block. The shelter housed about 1,000 people that would stay in the shelter, and then there were also an additional 1,000 people on the perimeter that would stay in tent encampments. And the interesting thing about, Jerome knew everyone on the Block, right? I found this very interesting. He said of the people that were staying around the perimeter of the Block, about half of them were not experiencing homelessness. I was like, well, what do you mean? And this was seconded by many of the workers. They're like, yeah, these people are basically just vacationing, was the term that they used. So it's people that, like, think about where would you go if you wanted to engage in illicit drug activity or sex work? You would go to these areas, right, in every major city. And so we've got a lot of people that basically just maybe would stay there and then go home afterwards. Fascinating thing we can follow up at later, but there were these fast tracking meetings where if there were, there was one day where it was, 18 vacancies from their service system, and they would get social service workers from all over the city would come to this meeting and sort of advocate that their clients deserved access to the next in line for that spot. And they would sort of argue over who was the most ready to go into that or most deserving for those vacant places. And at one point somebody goes, something's different, who's missing, where's Jerome? Jerome was taking a phone call, comes back in, and he goes, oh, he recognized the name, he goes, oh, they just got arrested 2 days ago, and they'll be in jail for the next couple weeks. And so that dismissed that person. Then he goes, that person would be good, that person would be the, and so he started giving details on these people, these case managers' clients. He knew them more than their case manager did. So you can see how this is, this red tape warrior is very valuable. And so, on a side note, the police officers in the area, because of the reputation that it had, there were 1,600, as you can see, in 3 months, 1,600 arrests. They would come through and arrest indiscriminately. So you can imagine if you're a worker and you've got these clients that you've got all this documentation for to be able to get into housing, and they're throwing everything away, you just basically made it so that they can't get into housing, and they're going to be there longer, in fact, just by throwing all their services away, or their resources. So I want to throw that in there, but what I'm going to focus on today, my findings, I have a bunch of different chapters, but I'm going to focus in on the arduous bureaucracy, and then a chapter that I call fitting stories, which is actually one chapter that is published in the most notable ethnographic journal called the Journal of Contemporary Ethnography. And if we have some time, I'll come back, or if Q&A, I can come back into some of these other ones. But as you can see, one of the roles that these workers would do would be negotiate signing a lease with landlords, and a process often overlooked by much research, and managing clients, because clients in the end, they have to go for it. If they don't, if they decide against it, or the landlord backs out, it all goes away. So they're basically managing many different variables here in this process. They're not just sort of punching the clock. So in dealing with and understanding, my goal is for you to understand this arduous process. If it's confusing, that's the main point. I'm trying to simplify it for you. So the U.S. Housing and Urban Development, or HUD for short, has these funds called the Continuum of Care. And in order for people to qualify for services, they need to, this is the official statement here, they need to be part of certain groups: veterans, homeless families, homeless youth. Youth can be 18, but they also, most cities go up to about 24 and younger to help in that category. And if everyone in here, this is what I say in my class every time I present, if you all experienced homelessness tomorrow, and let's say it was a very unfortunate thing, your friends and family are gone, you don't have any resources like that, you'd have to fit one of these categories, okay? And so, in other words, single adults who are non-veterans are limited in their eligibility. And so that's oftentimes a big starting point to understanding this housing system. So what we have here in scenario A, you can get housing in less than a year if you fit those categories. In the Homeless Assistance Grant, Continuum of Care category, family, again, veteran, youth, or chronic homelessness. And so if you don't fit those, there are other options, but you'll notice in scenario B, the time that you'll have to wait on the streets in order to be eligible the waiting list is about 7 years long. It's changed a little bit last year, but we'll get to that. But this is how it's been for decades. I want to emphasize that. This is not unique, and this is across the nation. This is not just this city, okay? So, and most people don't know that unless you've had the work experience that I have. And there were those fast track meetings that I talked about where Jerome knew everybody. So yeah, if you knew somebody who could sort of get you in it, so long as you were vulnerable enough, or as I call it, like sick enough, then you could be expedited as well. So in a nutshell here, this is an overview of the process that says the streets, and then level 1 is in the emergency shelters, level 2 is the transitional housing, level 3 is permanent housing. And this is sort of like what is meant to get someone off the streets. And if you fit the right demographics, you can achieve getting into transitional housing or permanent housing, but the majority of the population bounces from the streets in and out of emergency shelters. So they're not, you can imagine my frustration when I see research that samples exclusively from transitional housing and permanent housing, and they say, "Eureka! We found that there's high, disability," and I'm like, "Yeah, you have to be in order to get in to transitional housing or permanent housing." Okay, and people in emergency shelters know that too, so they may answer the questions a little, with that kind of a bias. So basically, again, if you're not a veteran family or a youth, then you must be. The only other category to fit is chronic. So let's explore what chronic homelessness means. Chronic homelessness is, in a nutshell, these first two scenarios. You have to be 12 months straight continuously homeless for that long, or 4 times in 3 years. There's not a whole lot of science that goes into why this rule is there. Ask any social worker and they will complain to you in a nutshell these other scenarios where people can be homeless much longer, experiencing homelessness much longer. You'll see in scenario C, they finally fit the definition in the 4th time that they were homeless, but they've been homeless for years, and that can be even longer. Scenario D, they can be homeless, they can experience the homelessness for years and years and years and never actually fit the definition of chronic homelessness. And that's what the big complaint is. And I emphasize scenario G here, which is very similar to B. But remember, you gotta have a form of verifiable, meaning documentation. You can't just say, "Hi, I feel mentally ill," or whatever. You have to have a formal diagnosis with a disability. And so, in order to fit, there's a lot of time devoted to that. So I came across this, it's a very typical scenario, but it was especially kind of entertaining because it was a new social worker named Bobby. Bobby had a printout of the shelter nights that a client had stayed at the shelter. So what he was trying to do is, if you remember on the previous slide, the times where they were experiencing homelessness or not homeless anymore, right? They had to prove, remember, all this is verified. He had to they knew he was experiencing homelessness during these dates, but then there are certain stretches where it's like, well, where were they? And I made the joke with Bobby, and I said, well, what does HUD think, that they're like sneaking into housing or something? And he's like, actually, that's exactly it. Like, they won't approve him for housing. They'll assume that he was staying with a friend or something and no longer homeless, and then that'll make him ineligible for housing. And so they were, all the verification they could get Jerome to write a letter that's saying, I was working with him during that time, and yes, he was sleeping under a bridge or whatever. But the verification, all the documentation is just overwhelming. So he was taking hours to do this, calling around to the hospitals, calling around to the police stations to see if anyone could verify that he wasn't sneaking into housing. So all that has been the continuum of care, which has been going on for decades. The semantics of using the phrase continuum of care and funding has recently changed. So if you've got a question about that, I can follow up with you. But then there's this housing first, which is a much newer approach. They're removing used to be you had to basically prove that you could be eligible for housing by going through the therapeutic intervention before earning your place. And housing first, Samson Barris points as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If anybody's familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, your physical and, if you don't have a shelter, how could you be expected to, make good cognitive decisions, and all this other stuff? If you're in, every one of us, if we're given an unstable, unsafe environment, we're going to be making some pretty ridiculous decisions. So housing first is literally that, giving housing, and then sort of like, then people are free to then pursue therapeutic intervention afterwards. So, oops, I'm going backwards. So then my respondents, who were the workers, these red tape warriors, were telling me that they were experiencing a lot of success, but it's not housing first anymore. They were expressing this, remedicalization of housing first. It's like, well, they're still acting like they need to either fit certain demographics that are especially vulnerable, or that they actually needed therapeutic intervention before they would get their housing first place, which my respondents are like, that's not housing first, right? So, oops, I keep hitting back. So, which brings me to their frustration with the bureaucracy and the housing system and changing back and going backwards to old ways of doing things that are medicalized, which brings me to my fitting stories chapter. So as you can imagine, there are different strategies to actually make someone eligible when they might even think, or maybe newer workers who don't really know the service system very well might. There's one named Allison who basically early on in my research, she just basically goes, I'm sorry, there's no funding unless you for your demographic, she says. And then she's like, if you want to, she points them to the help wanted ads in the corner and says, good luck, basically. But and that's technically, according to the policies, that's how you were supposed to treat these people that did not qualify. But you get a more seasoned veteran worker who knows the system, and they start saying, like Jerome, he's like, well, he's filling out the assessment forms and he's going, he's like, do you owe anyone money? And they're going, no. And he's like, well, I saw you told me that you used last week. How'd you pay for that? And they're like, oh, I didn't pay. And he's like, so you owe them money, right? And they're like, yeah. And he's like, oh, I saw you get jumped the other day too. So that's a yes. And they don't remember it maybe the first time or whatever. And so probing deeper and having that knowledge of their situation sort of boosted their vulnerability scores to make them then eligible. There's one time where he even says to the person, he says, tell me where you're parking your truck to sleep at night, because I need to put that on this form. And the guy says, well, I got really confused, like, I'm not sleeping in my truck. I'm panhandling and getting in a motel every once in a while when I can afford it, pulling my bootstraps up, And he's like, I need you to tell me, he's like, you've been sleeping in your truck. And he's like emphasizing that, he's like, where do I put that on the form? Wink, wink, kind of thing. And so it's not necessarily lying, but it's legitimizing their access into the service. It's broadening that safety net. But I want to punctuate this with, I had an interaction with one of the supervisors, and he said basically, he said this with his manager in the room, and they were proud of it, and they kept repeating it to me. They were like, that's really, very profound. What they said was, he goes, if services are too stringent on the rules, then the services that they give people suffer, and they don't help many people because not many people actually qualify for services. And I was like, what a quote, because that's, in my experience, that's what I experienced too. It was like, we're trying to get people eligible, and when they do get eligible, then, they then can get in, but then they also have these additional stigmas that they have to deal with as well, like a diagnosis or things that they're, getting in on. But so their fitting stories is what I focused in on. I do have other, if we have time, I can get into some of the other findings, management with the landlords and management with the clients, with clients that were experiencing mental illness and everything. I actually focused in on that population myself when I was a worker. But in conclusion, I just want to emphasize that the barrier is extremely bureaucratic. Getting people into housing, it's not available for just anyone who wants it. Many people think that they see these long lines of people that they're outside the shelters, that they're just looking for a handout. But the thing is the bureaucracy and the rules literally prevent access to the exact demographic that the policy is meant to help. And I want to emphasize that. It's like that. So these workers are actually, once people feel rejected or get rejected with one worker, they come along and they're like, no, you can get through it with me. Let me tell you some certain strategies, And so that's how they're able to actually get people into housing. I want to also point to many research, a lot of research in my discussion chapter, but this notion of the prime downtrodden group. We always focus on this sort of cycle of one group to focus on, and then like a few years go by, and then we focus on another. And that was emphasized a few times throughout the book. The workers were just sick of that, because it's like, for example, Sean Bauer was a case, it's an alias that I gave, but he accumulated over 3,000 nights in the shelter, which was by far the longest resident there, but he didn't fit any of he scored really low on the vulnerability index, and he would leave for work early and come back late at night. And there are documentaries now that Samson Barris with Housing First is putting out, and there are many cases like that where people just avoid the shelter. What would you do if you needed to stay at a shelter? Would you stay around all day? And so one thing that Kate, one of my respondents, emphasized was that basically those people that don't fit eventually develop chronic health conditions, and that's the sad part, is then they finally are eligible for help after years of living on the street. And so I do want to emphasize there's one piece of research here, Snow and Goldberg from 2017, David Snow out in Orange County, did a cost analysis of private and public funded services, and basically came to the conclusion that the earlier the intervention, it saves the community costs substantially, millions. The earlier you can house people rather than waiting for them to develop all these chronic conditions on the streets, then it's a very expensive situation with people. And so he said this is basically true for the chronic populations and the non-chronic populations. And I know him very well. He's very similar in his advocacy, David Snow. And so they were essentially saying, how I overlap it with my book, is that these red tape warriors are saving just countless amounts of money by housing people early and getting them out of the system, rather than having them linger on the streets and develop their chronic conditions, even having more health needs. And so I want to wrap up by saying that
child, paying parents, or
I'm so glad you're asking
housing.
Yeah, there's a massive amount of funding now, and I did want to say this in my conclusion, and I emphasize it in my in the book, at the end of the book. There's just unprecedented amount of funding right now. They're throwing funding at it, but the rules are still there. So using that funding is still an arduous process. So when years from now, people that are arguing against funding this stuff are going to say, well, we did try funding it and it didn't work. So, and the only reason we have this arduous system is because we used to have very, it's like peanuts basically in our very limited resources. So we had to figure out which groups to give our limited resource. Now that they threw money at it, they should be opening it up. And in some ways they are, but it's sort of like a local level. It's up to the local level to kind of do that and use state funding or local funding. In Salt Lake City, they were using county funds to house people, and it was going above and beyond. That's the reason they were able to do the housing first method or philosophy so quickly and put it into action so quickly. But then that's why it angered the red tape warriors when they realized that they were starting to get very much bureaucratic and the old way was coming through again. They knew what it was like to see the successes of the removing those restrictions, and so they were angered when they saw that the restrictions were coming in again.
Going back and forth then, because then there's no logic to it, right? Demonstrated success is not a way to change policy, but hypothetical doesn't change policy. So it's almost like, again, we're just talking about how to propagandize, certain problems to get people to pay attention.
How do you take politicians and rub their nose in that verifiable evidence, right? How do you? It's right. We know this stuff. Samson Barris, who's most noted for the housing first philosophy, he's a psychiatrist and promotes the housing first philosophy. But he says basically we know enough about this stuff by now. We could house everybody tomorrow if we wanted to.
Because we did during the pandemic too, or during there's a cold snap and they could just put
we're too busy demonizing the wrong type of citizen or something. And right after this study, towards the end of it, they were pointing at the fact that they had funded Housing First, and then they moved on to fund an $87 million jail that was going right down the street, and it was basically that's going to be the big answer now. So it's like there's obviously private prisons basically like is a national issue. So,
and I think by the way, I think